The hot sun beat down on the dusty airstrip, the heat waves rippling off the pavement. A sleek private plane sat parked, its engines still humming from a recent landing. The pilot, a well-dressed man in a crisp white uniform, adjusted his tie and checked his watch. He had just completed a routine flight, expecting nothing more than a quick refuel before taking off again. But what happened next would turn this ordinary day into a life-or-death situation. A group of masked men emerged from the tree line, their heavy boots crunching against the dirt. Dressed in tactical gear, they moved with quiet precision, their rifles slung across their chests. Their leader, a tall man with piercing eyes, raised a hand, signaling for silence. They had been watching the airstrip for days, waiting for the perfect moment. And now, with the pilot alone and vulnerable, they made their move. The pilot barely had time to react before he heard the sharp metallic sound of guns being cocked. He turned to see the armed men closing in fast, their faces obscured by black masks. His instincts screamed at him to fight, to run, to do anything. But he forced himself to stay calm. Years of training had prepared him for high-pressure situations, and this was no different. He slowly raised his hands, showing no signs of resistance. "Step away from the plane," one of the men ordered, his voice muffled by the mask. The pilot hesitated, glancing at his aircraft. He had flown countless missions, navigated through storms, and even faced mechanical failures in midair. But never had he been forced to surrender his plane at gunpoint. Still, he had to play along, at least for now. He took a step back, his eyes scanning the situation, calculating his next move. The gang moved quickly, taking control of the aircraft. One of them climbed into the cockpit, running his hands over the controls with an arrogant smirk. "Looks like we just got ourselves a free ride," he chuckled. The others laughed, already imagining the power and money that would come with stealing a plane like this. What they didn't know, what they had no way of knowing, was that their so-called helpless pilot was not just any civilian. He was a former Air Force officer, a decorated combat veteran who had spent years flying high-stakes missions in some of the most dangerous territories in the world. He had been trained to stay cool under pressure, to outthink and outmaneuver the enemy. And right now, these hijackers had just made a very big mistake. He kept his expression neutral, his body language unthreatening. The key to survival was patience. He needed to wait for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to turn the tables. These men were confident, cocky even, but that overconfidence could be their downfall. One of the hijackers stepped closer, tilting his head as he studied the pilot. "You seem too calm for a guy about to lose his plane," he said suspiciously. "What's your deal?" The pilot met his gaze, offering a small, almost amused smile. "I've been in worse situations," he said simply. The gang leader narrowed his eyes, sensing something off but unable to put his finger on it. He shrugged it off, motioning for his men to prepare for takeoff. "Doesn't matter. This bird is ours now." The pilot watched as they fumbled with the controls, pressing buttons at random, trying to figure out how to start the plane. It was almost laughable. These men might know how to handle guns, but they had no idea how to operate an aircraft like this. And that was where he had the advantage. The leader turned back to him. "You're gonna help us fly this thing. Otherwise," he didn't need to finish the sentence. The threat was clear. The pilot sighed, shaking his head as if in defeat. "All right," he said, stepping forward. "I'll help you." But what the gang didn't realize was that their so-called hostage wasn't just complying. He was setting a trap. Because once he was inside that cockpit, once he had control of the aircraft, everything would change. And they wouldn't even see it coming. The pilot stepped toward the aircraft, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The gang watched him closely, their fingers tense on the triggers of their rifles. He could feel their eyes scanning his every move, waiting for any sign of defiance. He had to play this just right. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and the situation could spiral out of control. He climbed into the cockpit, his hands brushing over the familiar controls. It had been years since he had flown in combat, but muscle memory took over. He knew this plane inside and out, its strengths, its weaknesses, and most importantly, how to manipulate it in ways these hijackers wouldn't expect. The leader of the group leaned against the open door, tapping his weapon against the metal frame. "No funny business, just get us in the air," he warned. The pilot nodded, his expression calm. "You got it." As he reached for the controls, his mind raced through possible scenarios. He needed to buy time, figure out exactly who these men were and what they wanted. Were they after money, trying to smuggle something across the border, or was this something bigger? He needed answers, but first he had to make them believe he was cooperating. He flipped a few switches, letting the plane hum to life beneath his fingers. The vibrations of the engine sent a familiar pulse through his body, a feeling he had missed since leaving the military. He adjusted the fuel levels, his eyes flicking to the reflection in the glass. The gang members were still outside, exchanging quick words, their body language tense but controlled. They weren't nervous, not yet. That meant they thought they were in control. "Where are we going?" he asked, keeping his tone even. The leader smirked. "You don't need to know that. Just get us off the ground." The pilot nodded again, but in his mind, he was already working through their options. If they were trying to flee somewhere far, they'd need a flight path. Did they have coordinates? A plan? Or were they improvising? He could use that to his advantage. One of the younger hijackers, a guy who looked barely out of his teens, leaned closer. "How long until we take off?" "Few minutes," the pilot replied. "I need to run through pre-flight checks." The leader scoffed. "We don't have time for that." "You want to make it in the air without the engines stalling mid-flight?" The pilot countered. "Then I suggest you let me do my job." The leader glared at him for a long moment, then gave a reluctant nod. "Fine, but make it quick." The pilot turned back to the controls, carefully adjusting a few settings. In reality, he was doing more than just pre-flight checks. He was searching for anything he could use to his advantage. Every aircraft had emergency protocols, fail-safe systems that could turn the tide in a crisis. If he could subtly disable certain functions, he might be able to prevent them from getting too far. He glanced at the fuel gauge, an idea forming in his mind. If he could limit their range, they wouldn't have enough fuel to reach wherever they were trying to go. But he had to be smart about it. If they caught on, they wouldn't hesitate to use force. "How do you know how to fly a plane like this?" the younger hijacker asked, curiosity creeping into his voice. The pilot smiled faintly. "It's not my first time in the air." "You a commercial pilot?" "Something like that," he said vaguely. He wasn't about to tell them about his time in the Air Force, about the missions he had flown, or the enemies he had outmaneuvered. That information was his advantage, and he wasn't going to give it away just yet. The leader rolled his shoulders, glancing at his men. "Enough talking, get us moving." The pilot exhaled slowly and placed his hands firmly on the controls. He could feel the weight of their guns pointed at his back, the unspoken threat in the air. They thought they had him trapped, thought they had everything under control. But what they didn't know was that this wasn't the first time he had faced men with weapons and bad intentions. This wasn't the first time he had been backed into a corner. And it certainly wouldn't be the first time he found a way out. The engines roared to life, sending a low vibration through the aircraft as the propellers spun faster. The pilot kept his hands steady on the controls, his face calm despite the chaos brewing inside his head. Every second that passed, he learned more about the men holding him hostage. Their movements, their voices, their level of confidence, he was picking up on all of it. The leader, the one calling the shots, stood closest to the cockpit. He carried himself with authority, but there was something off about him. He wasn't as disciplined as a trained soldier, but he had enough experience to be dangerous. The others followed his orders, but they weren't professionals. That meant they had weaknesses, ones he could exploit if he played his cards right. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, the younger hijacker leaned over the pilot's shoulder again, watching closely. "How fast can this thing go?" he asked, excitement creeping into his voice. The pilot glanced at him briefly. Fast enough. The leader shot the younger man a glare. Stay focused. We're not here to chat. The pilot suppressed a smirk. The younger one was clearly less disciplined, more eager, maybe even reckless. That could be useful. If things got out of control, he'd be the easiest to manipulate. The plane gained speed, rolling smoothly down the dirt runway. The pilot kept his grip light on the controls, pretending to focus only on the takeoff. But in his mind, he was calculating. He needed to figure out where they were headed and why. If he had that information, he could work out a way to stop them. The leader stepped closer. Once we're in the air, you'll follow our instructions. No detours, no tricks. The pilot nodded, but his mind was already a step ahead. He had a few tricks up his sleeve, ones they wouldn't see coming. The wheels lifted off the ground, and the plane climbed steadily into the sky. The hijackers relaxed slightly as they watched the land shrink below them. They thought they had won. They thought they were in control. They were wrong. The pilot kept his voice steady. So, what's the plan? The leader studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Then he smirked. We've got business to handle. You just make sure we get there. Vague, but expected. The pilot had dealt with people like this before, men who thought keeping secrets gave them power. But they had already made one mistake. They underestimated him. He adjusted a few dials, pretending to focus on the instruments. I'll need a destination, unless you want me to just fly in circles. The leader narrowed his eyes, then gave a set of coordinates. The pilot's stomach tightened. He recognized the numbers. They were heading toward a remote location, far from major cities, far from air traffic control. That meant no witnesses. That meant whatever they were planning, they didn't want anyone else to see. The younger hijacker spoke up again. How long till we get there? Couple of hours, the pilot answered. He glanced at the fuel gauge, subtly adjusting a few controls. If he could make it seem like they were burning fuel faster than expected, he might be able to force an emergency landing. It was risky, but it was one of the few advantages he had. The leader crossed his arms. No surprises, no sudden moves. You do anything suspicious, and it won't end well for you. The pilot met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Understood. But he had no intention of letting them reach their destination. He just had to figure out the right moment to act. The plane continued its steady climb, the clouds stretching endlessly around them. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, masking the tension in the air. The pilot kept his breathing even, his hands steady. He had been in tight spots before. He had flown through storms, dodged enemy fire, landed planes with barely enough fuel to make it. This was just another mission. The only difference was that this time, the enemy was sitting right behind him, and they had no idea what he was capable of. The plane soared through the open sky, steady and smooth, but inside the cockpit, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The pilot kept his hands on the controls, his expression calm, but his mind was racing. The hijackers thought they had him under control, but they didn't realize he was already setting things in motion. Every subtle adjustment he made was part of a plan, one they wouldn't see coming until it was too late. The leader stood just behind him, arms crossed, eyes sharp. He was watching for any sign of trouble, but the pilot knew how to play the part. He'd been in high-pressure situations before. He knew how to make his body language relaxed, how to mask his real intentions beneath a steady voice. The younger hijacker shifted in his seat, restless. "We're making good time, right?" he asked, his tone eager. The pilot nodded. So far, so good. But that wasn't entirely true. The adjustments he had made to the fuel system were working. Slowly but surely, the goat was dipping lower than expected. Eventually, they would have no choice but to land early. The leader didn't seem concerned, yet. "Let me know when we're close," he said, then turned back to his men. They murmured amongst themselves, speaking in hushed voices, but the pilot caught pieces of their conversation. Names, numbers, something about a pickup. They weren't just trying to escape. They were meeting someone. That changed everything. The pilot needed to know who was waiting for them. If this was bigger than just a hijacking, if there was another group involved, he had to stop them before they reached their destination. But how? He couldn't take all of them on alone, at least not yet. He needed them off balance. He took a breath, then glanced back. We might have a problem. The leader's head snapped toward him. What kind of problem? The pilot tapped the fuel gauge. We're running lower than expected. We won't make it all the way. The leader's expression darkened. You're lying. The pilot shrugged, keeping his voice even. You can believe me or not, but if we don't land soon, this plane is going down. The leader's jaw tightened. He glanced at the fuel gauge, his suspicions still evident. How much time do we have? Less than an hour before we hit critical levels, the pilot lied smoothly. We need to set down somewhere safe before that happens. The leader cursed under his breath, then turned to his men. Find us a landing spot. The younger hijacker leaned over, checking a device in his hand. There's an old airstrip about 40 miles out. We can set down there. The leader nodded, then pointed at the pilot. Take us there. The pilot didn't argue. He adjusted their course, guiding the plane toward the isolated airstrip. He didn't know exactly what would happen when they landed, but it was his best shot. If he could get them on the ground, he'd have more options. Maybe he could escape, maybe he could get word out. Anything was better than being trapped in the air with armed men. The plane descended, the ground coming into view. The airstrip was old, cracked, surrounded by nothing but dense trees and open fields. No signs of life. It was perfect. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical whir, and the pilot guided the plane down, the tires touching the ground with a smooth bounce. He exhaled, keeping his expression neutral, but inside, he was preparing for whatever came next. The leader wasted no time. Everybody out, he ordered. The pilot hesitated. If we shut down the engines completely, it's going to take time to restart them. We'll be sitting ducks if someone comes looking. The leader narrowed his eyes, considering. Fine. Keep them running, but don't try anything. The hijackers moved quickly, weapons raised, checking their surroundings. The pilot unbuckled his harness, standing slowly. His heart pounded, but he kept his breathing steady. He was on the ground now. That gave him a chance. But as soon as he stepped out onto the dirt runway, his stomach dropped. A second group of men was already waiting, and they were armed. The moment the pilot stepped onto the dirt runway, he knew things had just gone from bad to worse. The second group of men stood in formation near a row of old vehicles, their weapons lowered but ready. They weren't surprised to see the plane land. They had been expecting it. The leader of the hijackers stiffened beside him, exchanging a glance with one of the men in the other group. It was a brief look, but the pilot caught it. Recognition, maybe even tension. These weren't allies greeting each other. There was something off. One of the newcomers, a tall man with a thick build, stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm. You're late. The hijacker leader shrugged, his posture tense. Ran into some fuel issues, nothing we couldn't handle. The tall man's gaze shifted to the pilot, studying him for a moment before looking back at the leader. And him. The leader hesitated, but just for a second. He's useful. The pilot kept his face neutral, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just about stealing a plane. There was something bigger going on, something the hijackers weren't in full control of. The second group wasn't just here to pick them up. They had their own agenda. The tall man didn't seem fully convinced. Get the cargo off, he ordered, motioning to the plane. We'll take it from here. Cargo. The word sent a chill through the pilot's spine. He had assumed they wanted the plane itself, but now he realized they had been transporting something or someone. And whatever it was valuable enough for these men to be waiting for it. The younger hijacker moved toward the cargo hold, but the leader stepped in front of him. "We need to talk first," he said, his voice low. The tension thickened. The tall man folded his arms. "There's nothing to talk about. You brought what we asked for, and now we're taking it." The leader shook his head. That wasn't the deal. The pilot could feel the shift happening. Whatever agreement they had before wasn't holding up anymore. The leader had been confident back on the plane, in control. But here, on the ground, with another group just as armed as his own, that control was slipping. The second group's men subtly adjusted their stance, fingers inching closer to their triggers. The pilot recognized the signs. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was a standoff waiting to explode. He took a step back, slow and measured, careful not to draw attention. If this turned violent, he needed to be ready. He glanced at the cockpit, the engines still running. He could make a run for it, get the plane back in the air, but not without drawing fire. And if they had something dangerous in the cargo hold, flying it out of here could be just as bad. The leader exhaled sharply. "We risked a lot to get this here. We're not handing it over without a guarantee." The tall man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The guarantee is that you walk away." The silence that followed was razor-sharp. The younger hijacker shifted uncomfortably, gripping his weapon a little tighter. The pilot saw it before it happened, the flicker of hesitation, the slight movement of the leader's hand. It was small, but it was enough. The tall man's expression hardened. Wrong move. Everything happened at once. A gunshot split the air, followed by a flurry of movement. The hijackers ducked behind cover as the second group opened fire. The pilot instinctively dropped to the ground, rolling behind the plane's wheel for protection. Dirt kicked up around him as bullets struck the ground nearby. The chaos was instant and brutal. The leader and his men fired back, but they were outnumbered. The second group was more coordinated, more prepared. They had been expecting this. The pilot pressed himself against the plane's body, breathing hard. He had to think fast. The firefight wouldn't last long. Someone was going to come out on top, and if he was still standing in the middle of it, he wouldn't have a choice in what happened next. He scanned the area, looking for an opening. The cockpit was close, but the gunfire was too heavy. Running for it would be suicide. But if he stayed put, he'd be at the mercy of whoever won this fight. Then he saw it. One of the second group's vehicles, parked just a few yards away, the door slightly open. If he could reach it, he might have a way out. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was something. He took a deep breath, tensed his muscles, and prepared to move. He had one chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. The pilot's breath was steady, his mind sharp. Every muscle in his body tensed as he prepared to make his move. The gunfire raged on, echoing through the open airstrip. He had seconds, maybe less, before the fight tilted in someone's favor. If he didn't act now, he'd lose his chance. He sprinted toward the open vehicle, staying low as bullets zipped past. His heart pounded, but he didn't hesitate. He dove into the driver's seat, yanking the door shut behind him. His fingers fumbled for the keys, but there were none. His stomach dropped. Whoever had been driving this had left it running, until the engine had cut off in the chaos. He looked up. Through the cracked windshield, he saw the leader of the hijackers pinned down behind a rusted crate, his face twisted with frustration. The second group was closing in, moving like they had already won. It was only a matter of time before they finished the job. The pilot had one last option. He reached under the dashboard, fingers working fast. Years in the Air Force had given him more than just combat experience. He knew vehicles, knew how to work around a dead ignition. A few quick adjustments, a spark, and the engine roared to life. The sudden noise drew attention. A figure from the second brute turned toward the vehicle, raising his weapon. The pilot didn't wait. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires kicking up dust as the truck lurched forward. The man dove out of the way just in time, his shot missing its mark. The pilot's pulse raced. He had a choice. He could escape now, leave them all behind, or he could even the odds. His hands gripped the wheel. He made his decision. He spun the truck around, speeding toward the second brute's cover positions. The armed men scattered, their formation breaking apart as they tried to dodge the sudden attack. The leader of the hijackers saw his opening. Without hesitation, he and his men pushed forward, reclaiming the ground they had lost. The gunfire intensified, but the momentum had shifted. The pilot didn't stop. He veered toward the plane, skidding to a halt just outside the cockpit. He jumped out, moving fast. If he could get back in the air, he could put an end to this for good. But as he climbed into the pilot's seat, the leader of the hijackers appeared at the door, his gun raised. His face was slick with sweat, his breathing heavy. "You're not leaving," he said. The pilot met his gaze, unflinching. "You need me to fly this plane, and I'm not taking you anywhere." The leader's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a voice called out from behind him. The tall man from the second group was still standing, blood staining his sleeve, but his eyes were sharp. "You don't get to decide how this ends." The leader turned, his gun shifting slightly, and that was all the pilot needed. He lunged forward, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting hard. The gun went off, the shot hitting the side of the cockpit as the weapon clattered to the floor. The pilot didn't hesitate. He shoved the leader backward, sending him stumbling down the stairs. Without looking back, he slammed the door shut and locked it. His hands flew over the controls, bringing the engines to full power. Outside, the second group was regaining control. The hijackers were outnumbered, and without their leader giving orders, their fight was crumbling. The pilot didn't wait to see who would come out on top. He pushed the throttle forward, the plane rolling down the airstrip. Just as the nose lifted off the ground, a final shot rang out. A bullet struck the fuselage, but it was too late. The plane was airborne, climbing fast. The pilot exhaled, his grip steady on the controls. He had done it. He was free. But then, a soft noise behind him made his stomach twist. He wasn't alone. The leader of the hijackers had made it onto the plane, and he wasn't finished yet. The pilot's breath caught in his throat. The engines roared, the plane climbing higher into the sky, but he wasn't safe yet. A slow, deliberate sound echoed from behind, a boot stepping forward on the metal floor. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The hijacker leader was still alive. The pilot's grip tightened on the controls. His mind raced through every possible move. The plane was airborne now, but that didn't mean he had control of the situation. The leader had managed to sneak aboard, and he wouldn't have done that without a plan. "You're a stubborn man," the leader said, his voice edged with frustration. "I should have put a bullet in you back at the airstrip." The pilot kept his focus ahead, eyes locked on the horizon. He couldn't afford to let panic take over. "You had your chance," he said, voice steady. There was a pause, then the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "And now I have another one," the leader said. The pilot took a slow breath. He had seconds to act. His options were limited. He couldn't fight him off while flying, and there was nowhere to run. But he did have one advantage. The leader didn't know just how much control he had over this plane. He reached forward, his fingers brushing over a specific switch. With one quick motion, he pulled it. The cabin lights flickered. A warning alarm blared. The plane lurched violently, tilting to the side as the autopilot disengaged. The sudden movement sent the leader stumbling, his balance momentarily thrown off. The pilot didn't wait. He pushed himself out of his seat, twisting around just in time to grab the leader's wrist as he aimed the gun. The weapon went off, the bullet punching into the ceiling, but the pilot didn't let go. They struggled in the narrow space, the plane rocking as the pilot wrestled for control. The leader was strong, but he was injured. His movements weren't as quick as before. The pilot used that to his advantage, twisting his arm until the gun slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. The leader lunged for it, but the pilot was faster. He shoved him backward. slamming him against the cockpit door. The man let out a sharp gasp as the impact knocked the wind out of him. The pilot didn't hesitate. He grabbed the emergency parachute strapped under the co-pilot's seat and yanked it free. In one swift motion, he pulled the leader forward and forced the straps over his arms. The leader struggled, but the pilot was done playing games. He got the emergency hatch release. The wind roared as the door blew open. The sudden force pulled at them both, the rush of air deafening. The leader's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. He reached out, trying to grab onto something, but the pilot didn't let him. "You're not flying this plane," the pilot said, and with one final shove, he sent the leader tumbling out into the open sky. The parachute deployed instantly, yanking the man upward as the wind carried him away. The pilot watched for only a second before slamming the hatch shut, sealing himself back inside. Silence settled over the cockpit, broken only by the steady hum of the engines. His chest rose and fell with deep, controlled breaths. It was over. He sank into the pilot's seat, hands moving automatically over the controls, stabilizing the plane. The airstrip was long behind him now, nothing more than a dark blur below. He had no idea what had happened to the remaining hijackers, but that wasn't his concern anymore. His only mission now was getting to safety. The radio crackled to life. A familiar voice came through. Air traffic control, no doubt having picked up on the unusual flight path. "Unidentified aircraft, state your status." The pilot exhaled, pressing the transmitter. "This is Captain Ross. Aircraft secured, heading for safe landing." There was a pause, then a relieved reply. "Copy that, Captain. We'll be ready for you." As the plane soared through the sky, the weight of everything that had happened finally settled in. He had survived. The plane was his again. And whatever those hijackers had planned, it had ended here. He didn't know where the leader had landed. Maybe he was still out there, planning his next move. But it didn't matter. Because if he ever tried this again, he'd know exactly who he was dealing with. And he wouldn't be so lucky next time.